Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today, I'm doing something a little bit different, even though it is a common topic. But there's a brother. There's several social influencers, they call them in Brazil. On Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or wherever they may be. A lot of people who built up sizable audiences over the last, I don't know, decade. They have their own platforms, and some of them they're authors of like well-known websites in Brazil. Like, for example, the UOL .com.br website has a host of Black content creators. They write essays all the time, articles. And, there's other people who have managed to go on to, bigger things. Some people are on television. Some people have really big YouTube channels. So, it's a different world. I can say that in the 22 years that I've been into the Brazil thing, I've seen a lot of changes in terms of Black Brazilians finally getting some type of representation. Still a long ways to go, but I'm just saying, if you compare, say, 2022 to 2002, there's an enormous difference. And there are just a number of well-known Black folks, Black Brazilians, who have made a name for themselves online. People love their content, and they've carved out their own niche, on the internet, as part of the Afro-Brazilian media. And it's something good to see, because, some of the conversations that they are having, these are conversations that have been going on again since I can remember the old days of one of the first social networks, which was called Orchid. Brazilians pronounced it Orkut. But this was before Facebook came up. And just since then, the early 2000s, with Orchid, and then just blogs and websites, and then later YouTube, people started moving in on YouTube. I've seen an explosion of Black Brazilian content creators on YouTube, particularly over the last decade. So the material I'm going to cover today comes from an Instagram page called Afro-Estima, which basically means, like, instead of, Afro-Estima, the term that people usually use is autoestima, which means self-esteem. So saying Afro-Estima, it's material that's meant to raise the self-esteem of the African descendant population in Brazil. So he calls his channel Afro-Estima. I've featured him on the blog in past articles. But what I saw that really caught my eye recently was when he started doing material where I think he was like hosting a course exploring the origins of interracial unions in Brazil. And as I said, this is a huge change, because when I first started going to Brazil, back in 2000, there was no question. Most of the population were buying the mythology that Brazilian elites have been selling for years, that Brazil is a racial democracy. I mean, we all mix here freely among the races, between the races. So how could we be racist? But as people started, the consciousness of the Black population started to rise, and people had access to, higher education, they started questioning some of these ideals, some of the ideologies that were promoted in Brazil for so long, and coming to their own conclusions, like, is this really true? Like, yes, we're a very mixed population, but does that reinforce the idea that it's a lack of racism here? Where, as I said in another video that I did some time ago, it was somebody actually pointed out that the widespread mixing of the population is actually more proof of how racist Brazilian society is, because it shows in the statistics. It shows that a large number of Black Brazilians who move into the middle class and have, economic means, they tend to marry white. there's often a trade-off, and this is, I can't remember whose theory this was. It might have been Horacio Nogueira, famous Brazilian sociologist, where he was saying that Black Brazilians would trade off, their social stigma, which is being Black, and trade it off for, to ascend socially. They would, whether they got a white woman of the lower classes, it didn't matter. It was like the white partner's lower socioeconomic status, it leveled up the Black persons who might have the superior socioeconomic status, but the lower racial status. And it's just a Black person marrying a white person was seen as social ascension. It was seen as, well, you've made it, you have to have a white partner. There's a history in Brazil of, particularly you go back to like the 50s and the 60s. It was like, if you wanted to make it in society, you had to have what's called like a white godfather, somebody who could bring you into the world of the whites and get you accepted and, put you in, use his or her influence to get you into the world of the whites where, your world was supposed to improve. It takes you out of the Black ghettos, the Black favelas, and say, okay, come on over to the white side now, but you had to have a padrinha, a godfather, to bring you over, right? So today's piece is called Interracial Unions in Brazil. How does the family influence the choice of a white spouse? Now, this is something that I've talked about in several other videos where if you talk to enough Brazilians, particularly, Black and brown, what you can call them Black and mixed, some people say the whole Black and brown population just makes up the Afro-Brazilian population. There's still a dispute over that, how many Black Brazilians there are, how many should be considered mixed. I'm not even going to deal with that. The point is, if you talk to enough non-white Brazilians, they'll tell you that, yeah, the family has an enormous influence on the preference for a white partner when it comes to marriage and having children. I've talked to plenty of people who have reported this over the years. Plus, there's plenty of people commenting on this online. There's people who have written articles about this. So again, this is not, how Brazilians like to react and say, oh, that's your American perspective. Like, no, this is what Brazilians are saying themselves. I'm learning from what they're talking about. They're the ones that's talking about, like, yeah, my parents freely spoke about that. Like, why you want to bring somebody Black home and dirty up the family? You got to bring somebody home who's going to whiten up our bloodline, clean the uterus, as they would say, right? So in this article, the creator, I think his name is Moro Barasho, he's done a number of pieces on his Instagram page, just discussing this idea of interracial unions, why these unions are so common in Brazil. What is the expectation? Why do so many Black families seem to be going through this whitening process where within 3 to 4 generations, the family goes from a dark-skinned Black person to, what they call Brazilian white. Person may not be absolutely white, but in Brazil, they'll be considered white. So I like the discussion. So I've been reading a lot of I love the comments that come on my YouTube page. That's actually something I really enjoy reading because it gives me an idea of how people are connecting with the material. And people have asked a lot of questions. People have made some suggestions. People have pointed things out. They've suggested things I should cover, sources I could go to. I'm really digging that. There's a small percentage of Brazilians who are actually weighing in the comment section, and I appreciate that also. Because I've always said, whether from the YouTube channel or from my my blog, I was never here to speak for Brazilians, but to present the voice of what's going on with Black Brazil. And as Black media has grown in Brazil in the last 10 to 15 years, they're able to, express their own opinions. But, as it's in Portuguese, and most Americans or English speakers are not familiar, don't have a background in speaking Portuguese. So I felt like I was coming in to fill that void, Black Brazil presented in the English language. So I wanted to get into this today. As I'm saying, I love what he did with this article, and I'm using it because it delves into topics that I've already discussed on this channel, the topics that I've already talked about. So if you've watched some of the videos that I've already done on the interracial thing in Brazil, then you'll be able to follow along with, this production today pretty easily because it's going to cover a lot of things that I've already covered. So let's just get straight into this into this video covering this article. So if you translate this photo here, it would say, how does family influence the choice of a white spouse? Okay. So this is again taken from the Afro-Estima Instagram page. For those of you who read Portuguese, you can just punch in Modo Baracho Afro-Estima, and you'll find the article in Portuguese. So I'm featuring not only the article, but also some of the comments. It was just really some great thought-provoking comments that people dropped on this particular article. And it really goes into some of the requests that some of my viewers have had. A lot of people want to hear, what are Black Brazilian men saying about all of this? Because Black Brazilian men are constantly being accused of being palmiteiros, people who have a preference for white women in long-term relationships. And nobody's talking about the flip side. Like, well, how do you think that Black men are the ones indoctrinated when Black men and women are both under the same system of indoctrination? So, a lot of people are asking, well, what are the men saying? And there's quite a few men that commented on this particular article, and they made some very thought-provoking comments. It's something that I already believe myself, but it's good to see them saying this, because you can't say, well, this is the interpretation of an American. Like, no, that's why I often use the material that I use it, because these are Black Brazilians speaking for themselves. So let's get into this first part of the article. We have to lighten, in other words, we have to lighten the skin color of our descendants. We have to lighten. That's, this is how we would translate this piece right here. So this is what I'm going to be reading right here. I've translated it into English. So Moro writes, we have always discussed the external influence of affective choices for white people. Affective being affections, the external, and basically he's saying the influences of romantic choices that Black people have to link up with white people. We talk about media and friends, but we talk very little about the influence of our family in constructing our preferences. The family can be constituted not only as the first place of reproduction of racial hierarchies, but also as the place where we will receive the first incentives to seek a white partner. Part of the literature dealing with interracial relationships reveals how the family is a decisive factor in the tireless search for a love as white as snow. I don't really have anything that I can add to that, because this is something that I've talked about in several videos. Yeah, we know that the media is a form of social engineering where you want people to go or what you want people to think. But what's going on inside of these families? In my years visiting Sao Paulo and Bahia, I saw a number of formerly Black families that have transitioned into very light-skinned mestizos, or people of mixed race, or actually just white. This is something that you see after 3 to 4 generations. My question has always been the following. When people say, well, it's a democracy, that's why we mix. But after years of looking at this, my conclusion is the following. Many of the quote unquote white families in Brazil got there after several generations of mixing to where they become, at least in Brazil, considered white. Now, the Black and brown population that remains in Brazil, to me, it seems like they're the people whose family have not started mixing yet. That's just my interpretation, because rarely do I find, okay, show me a situation where a family is darkening rather than whitening, because that's just the standard all over the country. So the next piece, where he's talking about this book called Tornar-se Negro. This is a really good book. It was one of the first books when I first started learning Portuguese. It was one of the first books that I had to pick up, because it's almost an equivalent of like Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. She's just talking about the psychology behind the mental stability or instability of the Black population in terms of its own Black identity. And so what she's saying is what it takes to tornar-se negro, or become Black in Brazil, because it's not just about how somebody looks physically, because becoming Black is something that has to go on in the mind, and a lot of people for decades have rejected a Black identity that's been changing for the last few decades. Let me continue with this particular part of the article. So this part is called Grandma's Advice. Again, in the book Tornar-se Negro, meaning becoming black, one of the people interviewed by Neuza Santos Souza, Louisa, says her grandmother, who was also black, didn't like black people. She reports that she would hear from her that blacks aren't worth it. If you see some confusion, you know that it's a black doing that. If you see a black running, he's a thief, which is a very common saying in Brazil. The saying says that if you see a white man running, he's an athlete. If a black man is running, he's a thief. All right. She went on to say that she has to marry a white man to cleanse the uterus. The expression clean the uterus refers to the whitening ideology strongly disseminated between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Again, something I've talked a lot about. The famous painting of the Ham's Redemption that shows the progressive whitening of a family from dark-skinned black to pretty much white. You know, I've talked about that painting over and over because it so exemplifies the mindset in Brazil in a lot of black and brown families. Moving on to another one, presenting a black woman to the family. Or introducing a black woman to the family, either way. In the book, The Color of Love, Racial Characteristics, Stigmas, and Socialization in Black Brazilian Families, the American sociologist Elizabeth Horge Freeman says that to help her understand the role of the phenotype in love, her interviewee, Tiago, who was black, exemplifies saying that if he took the sociologist home and presented her as his girlfriend, his family would say they didn't like her. If he asked why, they'd say for no reason, but he knew that was a lie. They wouldn't like her because she's black with hair like his. According to Tiago, the family's refusing of a woman like Elizabeth would be because she had nothing to offer. Acceptance would be based on two conditions. Either she would have boa aparência, meaning good appearance, or she would be rich. Now, mind you, this term boa aparência is something, another facet of Brazilian society. I've covered this in several other articles. For years, going back to, we could say, I don't know, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Brazilian newspapers would openly, if people were looking for employees or maids to work in their home, or they were looking to fill some job position, they would openly put like, no blacks allowed, or preference white. And it just went by, like nobody said anything. Everybody knew what that meant. But after years of people complaining, like, that's open racism. It's, how do you just point a finger at the United States talking about, black water fountains and whites only water fountains? But then Brazil was doing it in its own ways. When you look in a newspaper and say, we prefer white here, or no blacks allowed, no blacks should apply for this position. So as it was so blatant for so long, they started switching the code for that. And they would call it, okay, if you want to have this job, you have to have boa aparência. Boa aparência, which means good appearance, is actually code for white. Like, you can't say we prefer whites here anymore. So we'll say we want somebody with a good appearance, which is a code for white. So listen to what, Tiago is saying to the sociologist, Ms. Freeman. He's openly saying, like, if he brought her home, Elizabeth, Freeman, Horge Freeman is a black sociologist from the United States. Like, if I brought you home, people would find something to say that, they didn't like you. And it would be obviously because she's black. And this is coming from a black family itself, right? I was actually still living in Sao Paulo when I had contact with Ms. Freeman. She actually sent me a copy of the book, The Color of Love. So very intriguing read if anybody's interested in this, going into this topic a little deeper. So the next segment, the hope of having lighter skinned children, the hope of lightening the children. In the book, Racism and Society, New Epistemological Basis for Understanding Racism, the Cuban researcher Carlos Moore reports that in 20th century Cuba, if a white man complained, or if a white woman complained that a black woman had tried, let me try this again. I think I did this wrong, but let me try to clean it up. Carlos Moore reports that in 20th century Cuba, if a white woman complained that a black man had tried to kiss her, the rural guardians, given the duty of killing blacks, would take action. However, everyone knew which white men were sleeping with which black woman. According to the social scientists, black families boasted about this since from the type of relationship, a coffee with milk offspring with quote unquote good hair and a thin nose would appear. So Carlos Moore's story is actually kind of intriguing. I want to try to remember how it, because I was always curious about how he, I know within the Caribbean, there was a lot of traveling. It's a really interesting history of how, the travels of different groups of people from one country to another. And if I'm not mistaken, Carlos Moore was born in Jamaica. I think his parents migrated to Cuba when he was young. So he actually grew up in Cuba. I don't want to mix up his story. I just know that I think he was born in Jamaica and he migrated to Cuba somewhere along the way. So he is from Jamaica and he's from Cuba. So he has a lot of background in understanding race relations in Cuba. He was actually a friend of Fela Kuti, the Afrobeat musician. Carlos Moore, I don't know where he lives now, but the last I knew, he was living in Salvador Bahia. So he started covering the situation of race in Brazil. So it's an intriguing thought that he has, because just this little piece that he talked about Cuba, I mean, how many of us knew this? The racism that happens in the United States is something that, it's known globally, but then you hear people don't know much about how racism functions in places like Brazil and Cuba. I mean, who ever heard that, if a black man was caught kissing a white woman or a white woman complained about it, then he could probably end up being killed in Cuba. That's a story that you just wouldn't expect. That's supposed to be something that happens on the United States, right? So anyway, this next piece right here, does love have color? Now, it's always been a way that Black Brazilians really skirt the issue of why so many, like particularly prominent Black men, but also Black women, seem to hook up with white partners for long-term relationships. And they'll say, well, love has no color. So he's asking a question here, amor ou amor tem cor, or does love have color? So love is not something that is above the differences of gender, race, and class. Nor is marriage an institution that aims to unite the different, and the family plays an important role in ours. This is exactly what I want to show you in the course, Does Love Have Color? The construction of interracial relationships in Brazil. So this is the course that he's talking about. This is the guy that I'm telling you about. His name is Moro Borracho. So where I'm going with this is I looked at his Instagram page. He has a lot of good material on his Instagram page. And I wanted to take this conversation to my audience as well, because these are some of the questions that people are asking. So these are some of obviously this is the article that I'm discussing today. And so I just took some of the comments that came from this Instagram page. Again, this is a conversation going on with, looks like, all Black Brazilians, Black men and Black women, and they're all discussing this issue. Now, what I noticed is that some of the conversation went into this whole question of which side, Black men or Black women, seem to have a preference for white people. Again, I did a piece a couple months ago talking about how Black men and women were pointing a finger at each other, talking about, no, you have a white preference. No, you have a white preference. So not only did they talk about the family aspect of the encouragement of whitening the family, but they also get into the expectations that Black Brazilian men and women have in search of a partner that often leans to whiteness. So again, this is, I'm going to get into some of these comments that I just translated it. But if you want to check it out, if you're a Portuguese reader, definitely go to the Afro-Estima website, rather Instagram page. So let me get into some of these comments real quick. Where can I start? So this guy named Jonathan says, Black families with self-hatred end up putting themselves in the line of extermination. Raquel says, many are not ready for this conversation. Then you get into, I don't know, I'll see how I can pronounce this, crocheteria. Says, I married a white man because in 25 years of my existence, he was the only one who asked me out. You get a lot of Black women who say that. They say that Black men ignore them and they have to open their options because, if Black men are not, stepping to them, then, and white men do, then it's just like they got to get in where they fit in. And I've seen probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Black women, making these, sharing these experiences. Neek says, first, this discussion should be separated. A black woman marrying a white man is a very different social fact than a black man marrying a white woman. The first is the result of double prejudice. The second is the action of being passed over, maybe a reaction of being passed over. And so this is just what I just said. You know, a lot of black women say they end up with white men because black men just passed them over. And this increases exponentially the higher the level of intellectual education and social ascension in both cases. Let me see. What is this person saying here? But is he a worthwhile white or a white person who doesn't even want white people? Maybe that's supposed to be a white person who doesn't even want that particular white person. It's like, so they're just kind of like asking, is this a person who's like a leftover white person that even white people don't even want? Intriguing point. I see some black women having several criteria getting with black men, but when the guy is white, this doesn't seem to exist that much, which is the same as what black men do. They accept absolutely horrible, silly looking white men, extremely uninteresting. But then he becomes a savior because he wanted a black woman, since the interesting white woman doesn't want him either. This is something that I've heard, something that I've seen as well. I've heard several people I've talked to over the years talking about foreigners who've gone to Brazil, and they talk about how, you know, like white male tourists from Europe will come to Brazil and they'll be the most basic, average, dorky looking white guy. And he'll end up with this drop dead, gorgeous black woman, you know? So this is something that goes back and forth. Like, this is what she just, I don't know if this is a male or female who wrote this, but this is something that she or he saw. Like, you know, I see this all the time. You know, I've already spoken on this because I got a piece that's coming up, hopefully sometime in the coming week, where a black clinical psychologist is talking about how black people seem to overvalue white partners in comparison to how they treat their own. In the United States, this is something that we often hear, but let me keep this moving. Okay, so this person is speaking to somebody named Francelino. You know, obviously these people are commenting back and forth and addressing their comments as certain people who've already made comments. So I have always said that whiteness is a quality that weighs on the scale. So it is easier to tolerate the defects of a white person, a woman or a man. While for those who are black, the scale always weighs more on the side of the defects. The requirement is that we are almost perfect in everything else because the quality of whiteness we will never have to offer. Real deep what that's saying there. It's just like we will ignore the defects that a white person will have. But if we're judging a black person, those defects have a heavier weight. You know, we have to be perfect, but any old white person to do. You know, we have to be perfect because we don't have the quality of whiteness to offer anyone. That's a deep comment. I mean, I think that speaks volumes for, you know, the mentality that you find among a lot of black Brazilians. Okay, that's heavy, but you spoke the truth. Every day I see a black woman saying that she married a white man supposedly because only he wanted her, placing him in a position as a savior, but that her whole life with blacks was extremely misogynistic. Now, I'm not going to dismiss, because, you know, there are black women who say this also, but you just have to wonder. You hear from a lot of people. In one of my previous videos, I highlighted this phrase where a lot of black Brazilian women say, you know, black women don't palmita. It means that basically what they're saying is that, you know, you can't call us palmiteiras because it's not that we don't want black men. It's just black men don't want us. So we have no choice but to date white men. And a lot of people are saying, you know, that's BS. Like, no, you guys have a preference as well. You just don't want to admit it. Keeping it moving. Of course, black women will live in solitude. Of course, black women will live in solitude, rather. They only seek and notice prominent black men, and there are not enough prominent black men for everyone. They would rather live in solitude and whimper that they are alone than accept that ordinary little black man who is socially invisible. Now, where have we heard this accusation? This is something that we hear in the Black American manosphere. You know, we hear a lot of black men complaining about this. Like, what is it to say that, like, a lot of Black women only want that top tier of Black men in terms of how much money they make, how successful they are, and they just completely overlook the average Black man. So as we can see, this same conversation is going on in Brazil. That's exactly what this guy just said here. I think his name here is Realidade Black, which means Black reality. I have several Black female friends who have adhered to this discourse of loneliness, but their Instagrams are full of likes and compliments from Black men. But because these men are Black men of low social and economic value, they don't care. Again, speaks volumes. Now, when a prominent Black man gives her a compliment, they even print out the screen, do a screenshot and post it to show that they were noticed by a guy of high social and economic value. This sounds all too familiar. What do you guys think? All right, hold it. Going to take a quick break here. This is going to end part one of this video. I'm hoping you're enjoying this material. I think it's very intriguing myself, and I'm going to finish part two very soon. I think I'm a little bit past the 32 minute mark at this point. So just want to invite you all to come back for part two. Hopefully it's just as interesting as part one. So hopefully I'll see you then.